Thinking, ideologies, and economic conditions of countries who fought in World War II. While each country had its own cause for joining the war, there were a couple things that were consistent across a bunch of major nations. So things to consider is World War II is obviously post-World War I, so during the interwar period, there was the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression. So all countries, essentially around the world, were in a state of economic despair. In this economic despair, countries, a lot of times after the war, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, a lot of countries were not satisfied with the things that, either consequences or repercussions of the treaty. So there was a rise in nationalism in a bunch of countries who felt like they either didn't get what they deserved or got too much punishment. Some countries felt that there wasn't enough punishment. Borders were changed, and a lot of countries were essentially unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles, and nationalism rose in a bunch of different nations. So as a response to essentially the egotistical reasons that countries were upset with the Treaty of Versailles, a lot of nations responded kind of in an overcompensating way. So rise in nationalism, which led to dictators, so people who were so desperate for change in their country that instead of going through a democratic process, wanted to shorten that and make those changes happen a lot faster, and they thought dictators were the best way to do that. And when we're entering the World War II environment, we have two different sides, so the Axis powers and the Allied powers, and we'll kind of talk a little bit later about the major nations and each of those powers and their reasons for joining the war. So the Allied powers there were more than these three, but we're going to talk about Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. So at the time, Great Britain was led by Winston Churchill, so he's the prime minister. And most nations at this time didn't want to join the war initially because, like I had previously mentioned, they have their own economic conditions that they need to focus on. So the infrastructure of a lot of countries at the time needed a lot of attention from their government agencies and from their economic resources. So Great Britain essentially kind of let Germany invade some countries before they really started to pay attention. So it wasn't until Germany invaded Poland that they really started focusing on things that Germany was doing. They obviously declared war after that, but before that, Germany had taken things like Rhineland and other things from different nations, and they had kind of warned Germany without taking the effort that they may have if they were in a better economic situation. So if they had the resources to kind of send over there to enforce the Treaty of Versailles or enforce those peace treaties, then they may have either declared war earlier, or it may have never led to that. And this happened in quite a couple nations, but they were afraid that by joining the war, it would worsen their economic situation, and instead, it actually created a lot of job opportunities. So they obviously needed bodies, they needed soldiers, so the military grew, jobs in the military grew, and then the same thing that you'll see in the United States. Back home, they needed a lot of manufacturing plants, they needed a lot of factories to produce those weapons, the food, the clothing, the materials that armies needed. So unemployment decreased significantly. And the United States, same thing, did not want to enter the war initially. They had their own problems to deal with: stock market crash, Great Depression. A lot of people were going hungry. A lot of people were unemployed, and they kind of wanted to focus on their own infrastructure instead of joining the war. Also, they're obviously on a different continent, so things aren't impacting them the same way, or they may not see it as an immediate threat the same way that countries like the Soviet Union or Britain would. So it wasn't until the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 that the United States joined the war. With that being said, they had sort of financially supported the Allied powers and kind of sent them money and resources, and so it wasn't wasn't a hard decision after Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. And they pretty much immediately declared war on Japan, which led to Germany declaring war on the United States. Obviously, Japan, Germany, Italy are all on the same side. So the United States ideology before the war was pretty similar to Britain in the sense that they didn't really want to enter the war initially. Their hand wasn't as forced as much as Great Britain would have been because they were clearly on a different continent. So things that may seem like an immediate threat to countries like the Soviet Union or Great Britain would have seemed less immediate to the United States. And at this time, the stock market crash happened on Wall Street. So when you're talking about major financial problems, the United States had plenty. They had lent a bunch of money to nations during World War I, and they were having some problems collecting that. Unemployment was really high, and people were going hungry. They didn't have the resources to feed their people, and they needed to focus on their own infrastructure instead of joining the war effort. With that being said, they did send whatever resources they could afford to, kind of under the radar, to the Allied powers. So nations like Great Britain and Soviet Union did receive some support before the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. So Japan thought the United States was about to enter the war. Their response was scare tactic, I suppose, of bombing Pearl Harbor, and the United States pretty much immediately declared war on Japan, which led to Germany declaring war on the United States, which caused the United States to enter World War II. The same thing that we saw in Great Britain, the United States was worried that by joining the war, it would worsen their economic conditions, and instead it created a lot of jobs. So the same thing with manufacturing plants, factories, increase in military, people were going overseas, and they needed bodies in the factory so bad that this is when you'll start to see things like Rosie the Riveter. So women joining the workforce because there just wasn't enough men left in the country to build those materials for all of their soldiers. And unemployment decreased by 10%. So really big financial change for the United States. So the Soviet Union was in a really unique position joining World War II. Unlike countries like the United States and Great Britain, Soviet Union was starting to border that German Empire. So when we're talking about immediate threats, that definitely applies here. Germany had boots on the ground, soldiers in the Soviet Union, whereas other countries didn't necessarily have that same ability of invasion. So Germany was able to quite literally just march over there instead of having to fly or put ships or anything, submarines. They're neighbors. And this quote right here, for every American soldier killed fighting Germans, 80 Soviet soldiers died fighting them. So when we're talking about human resources, the Soviet Union provided a lot of those for the United States and Great Britain. And the non-aggression pact that Germany violated was the thing that initially sent the Soviet Union to war. So there was a lot of different pacts created with the Treaty of Versailles and after the Treaty of Versailles to kind of contain Germany and prevent an incident like this. And when Germany violated that, the Soviet Union acted pretty immediately because they were so close. So it was such a direct threat to them. And with all the resources that they provided, they were able to change the course of the war because the Soviet Union's territory is so unique and it's so hard to navigate, especially during the wintertime. So German soldiers didn't have the same ability to invade that they would have in other nations. So the Soviet Union soldiers were really able to put a stop, especially in the wintertime. That's kind of where you see the end of the Nazi Empire. The course of the war changes when they try and invade the Soviet Union, and they're able to put those resources up against Germany in ways that other nations wouldn't have had the ability to, just because that territory, if you didn't live there and you weren't from there, would be incredibly difficult for you to navigate, let alone survive. and the Axis powers. So obviously this is the losing side of World War II. Germany led by Adolf Hitler, Italy led by Benito Mussolini, Japan led by Emperor Hirohito. Some things to consider here is the Axis powers were primarily dictatorships or some form of a dictatorship. So Benito Mussolini was a lot of inspiration for Adolf Hitler's policies, nationalism. A lot of these nations were upset about specifically boundaries. So the resources that they felt that they needed may have been located beyond the boundaries that they were essentially assigned after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. And they didn't have to go through the same democratic process that perhaps countries like Great Britain and the United States did. So they were able to make those decisions kind of overnight, where in a lot of other countries it would have taken months of legislature to get some of those laws passed that led to the eventual election of dictators or crossing those boundaries without necessarily consulting the entire population of a nation. They were able to do that a lot quicker.
In 1918, the Nazi Party was established. With a long history of anti-Semitism, the purpose of disestablishing big banks, big business, and big labor. They also have the objective to reclaim land for German expansion. They did not go and reclaim power easily. They faced opposition from liberals, socialists, communists, and even the church and the army. However, they rose through daring speeches from Hitler, brutal tactics on the part of the Nazi government and the secret police, and pure luck, like in 1933 with the Reichstag fire, which Hitler used as a reason to begin reducing civil liberties and arresting leaders of the opposing party. They did not win the election of 1933, but with the combination of the DNV party, they held the majority. And so Hitler's word became law through the Enabling Act, which did away with any previous constitutional rights. And so the Third Reich began. Hitler began to reclaim land in 1936 when he invaded the Reichsland, which was a territory in Germany on the western side. And then 2 years later, in 1938, he began to invade Austria and claimed that it was the last territory he would take. And through the Munich Agreement, promised he would never invade again. But a year later, in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and World War II began. The beginnings of dissent between the Italian government and France and Great Britain began after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles, which they felt was unfairly written because they were not included in the process. Even though they contributed to the Central Powers and World War I, they did not do enough for the Central Powers to believe them to be included in the writing of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1918, Mussolini became the leader of the Fascist Party and believed that they were a follow-up to Roman rule. And Mussolini used repetitive, convincing, and persuasive speeches to propel himself to power. In 1920, he established the Black Shirt Squad, which began rounding up hundreds of Italians who began to dissent and disagree with Mussolini. In 1921, the fascists had swept through much of Italy and controlled almost all of the territory it invaded. And the middle class did not put up much of a battle because it had little care to do with the government. Mussolini adopted many of Hitler's ideas of expansion and in 1935 invaded Ethiopia. And they wanted to boost Italian prestige and provide land for unemployed Italians, as well as to provide resources to help with the Great Depression of the 30s and the 20s. In 1940, they attempted to invade Greece, but failed miserably. Because they were already spread thin in Ethiopia, they failed due to lack of preparation, a fierce resistance by the Greeks, and a denouncement by Hitler, who believed it was a poor decision. And in 1943, the regime collapsed and was taken over by the communists, who continued their expansion and government control all the way through World War II.
So Japan was the final Axis power, and Japan was in a kind of unique position because, like all the countries at this time, they were impacted by the Great Depression, and they felt that there was not enough resources within their actual nation to provide. So while a lot of other nations kind of felt like they were owed or entitled to things because of who they were as a country, Japan felt like they were justified in invading China because it would give them the resources that they needed, quite literally, to survive. So after Japan invaded China, they also decided that they were going to invade other neighboring countries, so countries like Korea, and essentially they had similar governments, similar reasons when we're talking about boundaries for invasion as Germany and Italy did. So Germany and Italy had reached out to them about a partnership which formed, obviously, the Axis powers, and they kind of partnered together to supply financial resources, human resources, other resources that different nations would need to feed their military, information, talking about weapons. Japan was able to provide a lot of those, and when we're talking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japan was the closest to the United States for things like that. So they were kind of able to be that aggressor specifically for the United States, whereas Germany and Italy were a little bit focused more on what was going on in Western Europe, and Japan was able to kind of start focusing on the Asian continent and then provide those resources to attack the United States and be preemptive about those strikes. And kind of similar to Germany, they felt like it was within their right to take resources from other nations if it benefited them. So kind of the same thinking as Germany and Italy did. It wasn't necessarily viewed as an act of war to invade nations for their resources, but more of an act of necessity. So they had a lot of the same thought processes as Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler at the time.